October 1994, Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma. The soil smelled like chalk that morning, dry, alkaline, the kind of smell that preceded not just a bad season but a reckoning. Earl Meacham, 67 years old, pressed 2 fingers into the top inch of a wheat field he had farmed for 34 years and pulled them out dusty. He stood slowly, the way a man does when his knees have learned the weather better than any thermometer, and looked west at a sky that hadn't given rain since the 14th of August. He had 640 acres of winter wheat to get into the ground before the end of October. The calendar said 3 weeks. The soil said less. Earl owed $187,000 to First National Bank of Shawnee. The operating loan had been restructured twice since 1989, and this time the loan officer, a careful man named Dennis Hurd, had written a clause into the agreement that Earl had read 4 times before signing. Failure to service the debt from the proceeds of the 1995 harvest would trigger acceleration of the full principal. In plain language, one bad year meant the bank owned everything: the 640 acres, the equipment yard, the house his father built in 1938 from salvaged creek-bottom sandstone and lumber salvaged from a burned barn 2 miles east. His daughter, Karen, lived in Tulsa. She was a dental hygienist. She had offered to help twice. Earl had declined twice without elaboration. The National Weather Service forecast, which Earl had clipped from the Shawnee News-Star and pinned above his workbench, predicted a dry winter and a dry spring for central Oklahoma. El Niño patterns had shifted the jet stream north. The climatologist quoted in the piece used the word historic in a way that meant something catastrophic was coming. Earl read the forecast once, folded it, and went back outside. That was the fall that Pottawatomie County's wheat farmers lost more money than most of them had ever lost in a single season. Except one. The Pottawatomie County Cooperative Extension Service held its annual pre-planting meeting on October 11, 1994, at the county fairgrounds in Shawnee. 63 farmers attended, roughly half of what the room had held in the mid-1980s, when prices were high enough that optimism was still affordable. The folding chairs had been arranged in rows of 8. A third of them were empty by the time Gary Whitfield called the meeting to order. Whitfield was 41 years old. He held an M.S. in agronomy from Oklahoma State University and had been the Pottawatomie County Extension agent for 9 years. He was not an incompetent man. He understood soil chemistry, read yield maps fluently, and knew the difference between a Renfrew silt loam and a Port Fine sandy loam without looking it up. He stood at the front of the fairgrounds meeting room in a green OSU Extension polo shirt and walked through the official recommendations for the 1994-95 planting season. Variety selection, row spacing, seeding rate, herbicide schedules, fertilizer timing. Conventional planting depth, 1.5 inches. Irrigation management, conserve what you have. His tone was steady and professorial, and carried the particular confidence of a man whose views had not been seriously challenged in 9 years. When he opened the floor for questions, Earl Meacham raised his hand. Earl asked, in the same even voice he used for everything, whether anyone had data on deep furrow seeding at 3.5 inches in dryland conditions, specifically for projected dry winter years. Whitfield said the research didn't support depths beyond 2 inches in Oklahoma conditions. He said it with the patience of a man who had been asked a version of this question before and found it tedious. Earl said he had been seeding at 3.5 inches on his north quarter for 12 years. Whitfield said that wasn't a controlled trial. The man sitting next to Earl, a farmer named Tom Cutter who ran 480 acres northeast of Tecumseh, said quietly, "Earl, you're fighting the research." 2 or 3 people nearby nodded. Whitfield looked at Earl Meacham with the specific expression of a credentialed professional who believes he is being charitable and said, "Mr. Meacham, your field conditions are not replicable. What works in one corner of one farm doesn't scale." He said it gently. He said it in front of 63 people. The room moved on. Earl drove his 1978 Chevrolet C20 home that night on State Highway 177, 12 miles of flat two-lane bordered by dead grass the color of old straw. He didn't tell anyone what Whitfield had said. He didn't need to. 2 farmers who had been sitting close enough to hear the exchange drove past his farm the following week, and one of them told his brother-in-law, and by the end of October the story had simplified, the way these stories always do, into. The extension agent told Earl Meacham his method was wrong. That was that. Earl had heard it. He didn't correct it. He had a drill to calibrate and a field to plant. Earl's father, Clifton Meacham, had farmed this same ground beginning in 1936, arriving as a young man from Grady County during the middle of the Dust Bowl with $40, a mule, and a conviction that the land contained the instructions for how to farm it, that a man only needed to learn to read them. Clifton had been shaped by one conversation that he described, in the precise and economical way of men who were not given to sentiment, as the most important he ever had about farming. In the spring of 1938, a soil conservationist from the Soil Conservation Service named Rupert Hollies had stopped at the Meacham place while surveying erosion patterns along Coon Creek. Hollies had grown up farming in western Kansas before taking the government job, and he had spent the previous decade watching the conventional wisdom of shallow cultivation destroy the moisture retention that topsoil had built over centuries. He sat in Clifton's kitchen for one afternoon and explained, with diagrams drawn in pencil on the back of a survey form, what he had observed in the fields that had survived the Dust Bowl years with their yields mostly intact. The surviving field shared a specific set of characteristics. They had been planted deep, 3.5 to 4 inches, into stubble that had been left standing rather than incorporated. The standing stubble created wind resistance at the soil surface, reducing evaporative loss from the entire profile beneath it. The seed, placed deep, accessed subsoil moisture that plants rooted at conventional depth never reached. The gap between the 2 moisture zones, the dry 1.5 inches at the surface and the comparative dampness a foot below, was precisely the gap that killed most dryland wheat in drought years. Deep placement bridged it. The technique was not novel. Hollies said farmers on the high plains had practiced versions of it before the First World War. It had been displaced by mechanization, by the logic of deep plowing, by the belief that tilled soil was productive soil. The belief was wrong in drought years, Hollis said, and in central Oklahoma, drought years arrived on a rough 11-year cycle. He had the data going back to 1895. Hollis left the diagram on the kitchen table when he drove away that afternoon. Clifton laminated it, if laminate is the right word for the wax paper treatment men of that era used to preserve documents they considered important, and kept it in a worn green ledger notebook alongside 37 years of his own planting records. Date, depth, stubble height at planting, and yield per acre, going back to 1938. Earl inherited the notebook in 1982, the year Clifton died at 81, still working. He read it the way a man reads a legal document, slowly, in full twice. The problem the Extension Service had called a crisis, a dry winter following a dry fall, appeared in Clifton's records as a recurring condition, roughly every 11 years, going back to 1942. Clifton had named it nothing. He had simply noted the year, the conditions, and what he had done differently, and then recorded the result in the same column as every other year. Earl already knew what to do. He seeded the North Quarter first, 160 acres of Jagger winter wheat variety, planted October 17, 1994, at exactly 3.5 inches, using a 1979 John Deere 7000 FlexFold planter he had modified with extended seed tubes in 1991. The modification was not complicated. He had welded steel extension tubes, angled at 7 degrees, onto the original coulter shanks to achieve consistent seeding depth in varying soil conditions, without losing seed-to-soil contact at closure. The extensions were not a commercial product. He had designed them himself on graph paper in the blank pages at the back of the green ledger. After 2 seasons of trial with the original geometry, had produced inconsistent depth on the heavier clay soils in the East Quarter. The 7000 was John Deere green, as all 7000 series planters were, with yellow trim that had faded in 30 years of Oklahoma sun to the color of old mustard. It had 6,200 hours on the engine at the start of the 1994 season. Earl serviced it every 250 hours. New filters, adjusted coulter pressure, inspected seed tubes for wear. He kept the service records in a spiral notebook hung on a nail inside the shop door. The most recent entry read, October 15, 1994, 6,194 HRS. New disc blades 16-inch. Seed tube inspection all clear. Coulter pressure 95 pounds. He ran the drill at 2 miles per hour, not 2.5. Not 1.8. 2 miles per hour was the speed at which the seed tube geometry functioned correctly and seed placement held consistent. He had confirmed this by timing himself with the dashboard clock of the C-20 idling alongside the pass. He did not vary it. He left the wheat stubble from the previous year standing at 8 inches. He did not plow. He did not disc. He seeded directly through the stubble, using the coulters to cut a slot, place the seed, and close it with the trailing press wheels. To anyone driving past on County Road 107 that October, the field looked like neglect, a man planting into ground that hadn't been touched, that looked like it had been abandoned between seasons. Tom Cutter drove past on a Tuesday. He slowed his truck, looked at the field for a long moment, then kept driving without stopping. By the first week of November, the wheat had emerged. Thin, low, the color of pale green thread against the gray-brown standing stubble. Not impressive, but present. December came without rain. January came without snow. The National Weather Service confirmed that the winter of 1994-95 would rank among the driest in the central Oklahoma record, going back to 1895. The Cimarron River ran at 12% of its January average. Stock ponds on farms north of Shawnee dropped 2 feet in 3 weeks and did not recover. Earl put his hand under the stubble on a morning in early January, when the temperature held at 28 degrees, and the ground was iron-hard at the surface. He pressed 2 fingers an inch into the soil and held them there. He felt moisture, not much, but present. The stubble canopy above had slowed the evaporative draw on the soil profile below it, and what little moisture had fallen in October was still there, held in place, at a depth the surface wind could not reach. He noted it in the ledger, then went inside. He drove to the feed store in Tecumseh on January 9 to pick up a bag of ammonium sulfate. The conversation at the counter, among 4 men in canvas work coats, was about crop insurance payouts. Everyone had it. The consensus was that the 1995 wheat crop was effectively done. One man said county yields would come in under 20 bushels if the spring didn't bring rain. Another said 15. Gary Whitfield had been quoted in the News-Star the previous week, recommending that farmers in the eastern part of the county consider emergency. Cover crops to hold topsoil through the spring wind season. Someone at the counter said to Earl, "You got your stuff covered." Earl said, "I planted." The man looked at him. "How much are you in for?" Earl said, "All of it." The man at the counter, his name was Dale Simmons, and he ran 320 acres in dryland wheat east of Earlsboro, turned back to the others without comment. February brought a 1/4 inch of rain. One event the night of February 18. It fell slowly over 6 hours and was gone by morning. Earl walked the North Quarter the next day. The air temperature was 31 degrees. His boots left faint prints in the thin surface crust. Under the standing stubble, where the ground had not frozen as deeply as the exposed fields around it, the surface was damp. He pulled a sample plant from the row and measured the primary root with a steel tape. 11 inches, more than double what the Jagger variety typically produced at conventional seeding depth by 90 days. The root had followed the moisture gradient down through the soil profile and found what was there. A reserve that shallow-planted crops, drawing only from the top 6 inches, would exhaust by March. He noted it, February 19, 1995. Root depth at 90 days, 11.25 inches. 2 plants per foot of row. Moisture present at surface following 0.25-inch rainfall event. No signs of winter kill. He said nothing to anyone. In March, a delegation from the Pottawatomie County Farm Bureau drove past the North Quarter in a single truck. One of them said, without stopping, that it looked sparse. It did look sparse. The standing stubble created visual noise that made it difficult to assess plant density from a vehicle on the county road. What you could not see from 40 miles per hour was that the plant spacing, 14 seeds per foot of row at 3.5-inch depth, had produced a root structure per plant that was actively accessing moisture no surface-planted crop in the county could reach. April brought 1.1 inches of rain, divided across 3 small events, none of them significant. The state climatologist published a report in early April confirming that central Oklahoma wheat yields would likely average between 17 and 22 bushels per acre. He characterized the possibility of a saving late April moisture event as possible but not probable. The late April event did not arrive. By the first week of May, the county's wheat fields had taken on the color and texture of old rope, yellowed, tight-jointed, stressed. Fields that had been conventionally tilled in October, plowed under, disked flat, bare-surfaced through winter, had lost topsoil to wind during January and February. The rows were still visible in some of them, but only because the furrows had caught dust rather than because the crop was thriving. Earl walked the North Quarter on May 3. The air smelled of dry grain beginning to fill, the particular dry-sweet smell that a man who has harvested wheat for 4 decades recognizes as either promise or deception, depending on the year. The wheat was at Feek's growth stage 8, flag leaf fully emerged, the critical point at which grain fill begins and moisture demand peaks. He pulled a plant carefully from the row, keeping the root system intact, and brushed the soil from it with his thumb. The primary root measured 13 inches. The root system was branched at 8 inches, where it had encountered a denser clay layer and had pushed through rather than stopped. The heads were full. He could feel the weight of them against the back of his hand when he walked the row slowly. He did not celebrate this. He noted it in the ledger, May 3, 1995, Feeks 8, root 13 inches primary, heads present full tiller count, moisture at surface, dry, subsoil moisture accessible. He had contacted an attorney in Shawnee in January, a land-use lawyer named Richard Pell, not about the extension services dismissal, but about the acceleration clause in the operating loan. Pell had reviewed the debt instrument and identified a drafting ambiguity in the definition of proceeds from the 1995 harvest. Specifically, that the clause had not been indexed to a minimum price per bushel, which created room, in the event of a successful harvest, to structure repayment in a way that protected the land against any subsequent reclassification attempt by the bank. Pell filed a protective letter with First National Bank of Shawnee in February. The bank acknowledged it and filed it. No lawsuit, no confrontation, paperwork that changed the legal geometry of Earl's situation without requiring Earl to be in the room when it happened. The harvest was 3 weeks out. Earl Meacham began cutting the North Quarter on June 12, 1995 at 7:40 in the morning, when the dew had just burned off the wheat heads and the air carried the dry grain smell of a ready crop. Not sweet, exactly, but full, like the moment before a word is said. He ran his 1981 John Deere 7721 combine, a 21-foot header, across the rows he had planted 8 months earlier at 2 miles per hour. The cab reached 94 degrees by 10 in the morning. He drank from a metal thermos and watched the yield monitor on the dashboard. A Raven 450 he had installed in 1993, and calibrated himself every season against the co-op elevator's certified scale. He trusted it within 2 bushels per acre. He finished the North Quarter at 4:30 in the afternoon. He pulled the combine to the edge of the field, shut down the engine, and sat in the sudden quiet with the cooling tick of the machine around him and a meadowlark calling from somewhere in the grass along the east fence line. He pulled out the ledger and wrote, June 12, 1995. North Quarter, 160 acres. Gross, 8,640 bushels. Yield, 54 bushels per acre. He looked at that number for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and drove in. He called Corinne in Tulsa that evening. He told her the yield on the North Quarter. She was quiet. Then she said, "Dad," he said, "I've got 3 more quarters to go." The South Quarter averaged 51 bushels per acre. The East Quarter, which carried a heavier clay component that had held subsoil moisture more completely through the spring, averaged 57. The West Quarter, cut last because it fronted the highway and Earl preferred to work out of public view, averaged 52. The county average for 1995, published by the Oklahoma Agricultural Statistics Service in late June, was 19.2 bushels per acre, one of the lowest recorded yields in Pottawatomie County in 40 years. Earl Meacham's average across 640 acres was 53.5 bushels per acre. He delivered the wheat to the farmer's co-op elevator in Tecumseh in 3 loads across 2 days. The elevator operator, a man named Harold Bussell who had worked the scale house since 1979, weighed each load and handed Earl his tickets without comment. On the second day, after he weighed the 3rd load, Bussell put the scale slip down on the counter and said, without looking up, "How much wheat you got total, Earl?" Earl told him. Bussell looked at the ticket in his hand. He said, "Total bushels." Earl told him the total. Bussell put the slip down and looked at Earl directly for a long moment. He said, "You want me to just check the math on that?" Earl told him the math was right. Word moved from the elevator in the way that true information moves in small agricultural communities, not through newspapers or formal channels, but through specific named people, at specific places, in specific sentences. Bussell told his wife that evening. His wife told her sister, who was married to Dale Simmons from the feed store in Tecumseh. Simmons drove past Earl's field on a Sunday afternoon, stopped his truck on County Road 107, and got out and walked to the edge of the harvested stubble rows and stood there for a while, looking at them, before getting back in and driving away without stopping at the house. Tom Cutter heard the number from Simmons on a Monday. He heard it wrong the first time. He thought Simmons had said 45 and corrected his understanding the second time. He stood in his own harvested field, which had yielded 17 bushels per acre, and said nothing to anyone for 2 days. Gary Whitfield received a call from his regional supervisor at the OSU Extension office in Stillwater on June 28. The supervisor was Dr. Patricia Haverson, a soil scientist who had been with the Extension Service since 1984. She had seen Earl Meacham's yield tickets, which had been submitted to the Oklahoma Agricultural Statistics Service by the co-op elevator as part of the standard county reporting process, and had landed on her desk because the number was anomalous enough to flag the automated review system. She asked Whitfield, in specific and direct terms, what he knew about the Meacham Farms planting method. Whitfield drove to the Meacham place on July 2. He arrived at 9 in the morning. Earl was in the shop, servicing the combine, working on the cylinder drive assembly, a combination wrench in his right hand and a shop rag across his knee. Whitfield stood in the doorway of the shop and said he had some questions. Earl put the wrench down on the bench and said he could answer questions. Whitfield asked about the seating depth. Earl said 3.5 inches. Whitfield asked about the stubble management. Earl said, "I don't manage it, I leave it." Whitfield asked where he had learned this. Earl walked to the workbench and opened the top drawer and took out the green ledger notebook, Clifton's, with the wax paper laminated diagram in the front, and set it on the bench without opening it. He said, "My father learned it in 1938 from a soil conservation service man named Rupert Hollies." He paused. "Most of the science is in there if you want to look at it." Whitfield looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he looked at Earl. He said, "I told you in October that this method wasn't replicable." Earl said, "You did." There was a long silence in the shop. Whitfield looked at the floor, then at the door, then back at Earl. He said, "I was wrong." Earl said nothing in return. He picked up the wrench and went back to the cylinder drive. Whitfield photographed the field and the soil modification diagrams in the ledger before he left. He took a soil core from the North Quarter. In September 1995, the OSU Extension Service published Technical Bulletin E927, titled Stubble Retention and Deep Furrow Seeding in Dryland Winter Wheat Production. Gary Whitfield was listed as a contributing researcher. The bulletin corrected the recommended seeding depth for dryland conditions from 1.5 inches to a range of 2.5 to 3.5 inches in years of predicted below-average precipitation, and formally recommended standing stubble retention over winter tillage in conditions of projected moisture deficit. Earl Meacham's name did not appear in the bulletin. The correction appeared on page 3. Richard Pell finalized the repayment structure with First National Bank of Shawnee in August 1995. Earl retired the full $187,000 operating loan from the 1995 harvest proceeds, paid the interest, and retained a margin of $31,400, enough to replace the combine's header feed chain and rebuild the clutch assembly on the C20. The acceleration clause Dennis Hurd had written into the agreement was rendered moot by full repayment. The bank filed the satisfied debt paperwork without comment. A farmer named Gerald Purcell, who ran 480 acres in Lincoln County, 40 miles north of Earl's Place, heard about the 1995 results through Extension Bulletin E927, which his mail carrier delivered in September. He drove down to Pottawatomie County in early October and found Earl in the field, running the 7,000 through the first pass of the fall planting. He flagged the truck, and Earl stopped and shut off the drill. Purcell asked if he could see the seed tube modification. Earl took him to the shop. He laid out the dimensions on graph paper at the workbench: tube length, angle of deflection, mounting point on the shank, steel gauge, and wall thickness. He said the steel needed to be at least 3/16 inch wall to survive the Coulter vibration for more than 2 seasons. He said the angle was 7 degrees and not to vary it. Purcell took the paper home. He had a MIG welder and a 1981 John Deere 7000 of his own, same series as Earl's. He built the modification over 2 days in early September. He planted his north 200 acres at 3.5 inches that fall into standing stubble with no prior tillage. His 1996 yield on those 200 acres came to 47 bushels per acre. The Lincoln County average that year, a near normal precipitation year, was 31. The drought premium was smaller because the drought had lifted, but the margin was sufficient. Purcell replanted all 480 acres the following fall using the same method, and the 2 seasons after that. By 1999, he had retired the tillage equipment entirely. He mentioned Earl Meacham by name at the elevator every time someone asked. In the spring of 1997, Dr. Patricia Haverson at the OSU Extension Service initiated a formal multi-farm research trial involving 11 Pottawatomie County farms and 3 Lincoln County farms, studying the combined effect of deep furrow seeding and standing stubble management on dryland winter wheat yields across a range of soil types and precipitation conditions. The study ran 3 years. It concluded in 2000 and was published in the Journal of Production Agriculture under the title Residue Management and Seeding Depth Effects on Dryland Winter Wheat Yields in the Southern Great Plains. The paper's introduction cited Rupert Hollis's original Soil Conservation Service survey work from the 1930s, work archived at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland, and not consulted by the Extension Service in at least 4 decades. The study's conclusion stated that deep furrow placement at depths of 3 to 4 inches, combined with minimum disturbance of surface crop residue, produced yield advantages of 18 to 41% in dryland conditions, characterized by below-average winter and spring precipitation. The advantage widened in proportion to the severity of the moisture deficit. The paper cited Earl Meacham's 1995 field results in the first paragraph of its introduction as the observation that initiated the study. It described his method accurately and gave the yield figure correctly. He read the paper once. He folded it and put it in the drawer next to the ledger. Gary Whitfield retired from the Pottawatomie County Extension Service in 2003. Before he left, he revised the county's standard planting recommendations for dryland winter wheat one final time, incorporating the stubble management protocol fully into the official guidance document, not as an alternative practice, but as the primary recommendation for years of below-average forecast precipitation. The revised guide was distributed to 312 farmers on the Extension Service's Pottawatomie County mailing list. It was 4 pages. The second page described the technique in language that Hollis would have recognized and Clifton Meacham would have found entirely unremarkable. The Extension Service did not contact Earl before publishing the revision. He did not remark on the omission. Whether he noticed it was not something he discussed. Corinne Meacham Hobart drove out from Tulsa on a Saturday in October 2009 with her son, Daniel, who was 14 and had expressed lately some interest in the farm. Earl was 72. He walked without the slowness of a sick man, but with the deliberateness of someone who had stopped wasting motion some years before. He took Daniel to the shop first. He showed him the 7,000 drill, still green, still running, with 8,300 hours since its last engine rebuild. The extended seed tubes were still in place. He had replaced the steel on 2 of them in 2003 when the welds showed fatigue, but the angles were original. He held a steel rule against the tube and said, 7 degrees, not 6. Not 8. Daniel asked why not 6. Earl said, at 6 the seed contacts the front of the slot before it reaches full depth. At 8 you lose contact on the closing side. 7 is right. He set the rule down. Your great-grandfather didn't know the angle, he knew the depth. I found the angle by mistake in 1988 when I welded a tube wrong and it worked better than the others. I measured it afterward. He took the boy out to the North Quarter. October again, the stubble from the summer harvest still standing. The air had the cold mineral smell that precedes a killing frost, iron and chalk, and the thin sweetness of dry grass stems. The afternoon light was flat white diffuse with no shadows. Earl crouched at the edge of the field and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. He pulled them out. He said, "What do you feel when you do that?" Daniel crouched and pressed his fingers in. He said, "Cold and damp." Earl said, "That's the subsoil moisture. This field hasn't had rain in 6 weeks. The surface is dry. The stubble slows the evaporation from the profile below it, not completely, but enough." He stood up slowly. "When we seed in 2 weeks, we go to 3.5 inches. You'll find moisture at that depth even if the surface is dust." He went to the truck and retrieved the green ledger notebook. He opened it to the front, to the diagram Rupert Hollies had drawn in pencil on a survey form in the spring of 1938. The cross-section of a wheat field, root depths marked in a careful hand, moisture zones shaded in pencil hatch marks, the stubble layer rendered as a series of small vertical lines across the surface. The pencil had faded to gray, but the lines were legible. Earl had reinforced the wax paper laminate twice, in 1987 and again in 2001, when the original had begun to separate at the edges. He held the notebook out and let Daniel look at the diagram without saying anything. After a long moment, Daniel said, "Who drew this?" Earl said, "A man named Hollies, 1938. He paused. "He stopped here for 1 afternoon. He probably didn't think much about where it would end up." He put the notebook back in the truck and took Daniel through the service schedule for the drill. The spiral notebook on the nail inside the shop door, the 250-hour intervals, the specific items checked at each interval, and why each item mattered. He showed him the difference between a worn disc blade and a sharp one, and explained what worn blades cost in seating consistency. He explained the press wheel adjustment and why it changed by soil type. He did not ask Daniel if he wanted to farm. He did not suggest that he should. He gave him the information as though it were simply information worth having. When they finished in the shop, Daniel stood at the door in the fading light, looking at the 7,000 drill. He said, "Does it still work?" Earl said, "Perfectly." He closed the shop door and went inside. The North Quarter of the Meacham Place in Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma, is still planted in winter wheat. It has been planted in winter wheat every year since 1938, when Clifton Meacham arrived with $40 and a conviction that the land contained its own instructions. The 1979 John Deere 7000 drill still runs. Daniel Hobart, who is 30 now, services it every 250 hours in the same spiral notebook, on the same nail inside the same shop door. The entries are in his handwriting, which is different from Earl's, larger, more hurried at the margins, but the format is identical. Date, hours, what was replaced, what was checked, what was right. The green ledger notebook is in the same drawer of the same workbench. Hollies' diagram is still legible under its second replacement laminate. The yield records run unbroken from 1938 forward, in 3 different handwritings. In the same column format Clifton established the first year he put seed in this ground. In the drought year of 2012, when Pottawatomie County averaged 14 bushels per acre, the North Quarter yielded 48. Daniel noted it in the ledger without emphasis, in the same column as every other year, in the same format Clifton had used for years that were good and years that were not. The knowledge was not remarkable to the people who held it, not because it wasn't worth something, but because it had been held long enough and worked well enough to become simply the way things were done. The Extension Service's published study called it a discovery. Rupert Hollies had called it observation. Clifton Meacham had called it nothing at all, because, in his experience, a man who needed a name for how he farmed hadn't been paying close enough attention to the farm. Earl called it what his father had taught him to call it. He called it reading the ground. On a dry October morning in central Oklahoma, the ground in that North Quarter still smells like chalk. It still holds moisture below the stubble that the surface cannot explain. It still tells a man, if he presses 2 fingers in and holds them there, exactly what it needs and exactly what it will give back if the seed is placed where the water is and left to find its own way down.